Okay, so basically, this week is devoted in the New Testament readings to the book of Colossians. Day 5 starts out the book of Luke, and Luke chapter 1 is pretty long. But since it's just the first chapter, and we're going to be spending the next, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5 weeks in Luke, we'll hold off on introducing Luke and talking more about the Gospel of Luke next week. But for this week, the first 4 days are the 4 chapters of Paul's letter to the Colossians. Um, we read the book of Ephesians, and Ephesians and Colossians are oftentimes kind of put together, and a similar kind of background of the writing in terms of Paul's own situation and writing to this church in Colossae. And one of the key differences is, though, that in Colossians, Paul has not been with these brethren. A book like Ephesians or Corinthians, Paul has usually was responsible for converting the first Christians in that city, for establishing that church. And in Colossians, it was not him that started the church there, converted the people there. He talks about a brother named Epaphras, who seems to be responsible for all of that. And so Paul lacks the personal knowledge of this group that he might have with other churches, but still writes this letter to them. And somehow, even in spite of that, ends up really almost spending the entire 4th chapter with personal greetings and sending his love and encouragement from various people to various people in the church there. Colossians, again, not very long, and so we'll try not to say too much about it and just read it and soak it in. But I will point out that I think in some ways the message of Colossians could be boiled down to one phrase, 7 words that Paul uses in chapter 1, verse 27, when he says, to read the whole verse, God willed to make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And I think that phrase, Christ in you, the hope of glory, would be one way to think about the message, kind of boiled down message of the book of Colossians. It begins and all the way through is centered very firmly on Christ, which of course the whole New Testament, the whole Bible is. But Colossians really, I think, in a special way, focuses on Jesus. You'll notice that in the first chapter, in the prayer of thanksgiving, which is typical of Paul to begin a letter giving thanks for the people he's writing to, you'll notice in Colossians he kind of launches off from that prayer of thanksgiving into a very poetic and very lofty praise of Jesus and his preeminence and how everything has come from him, created by him, through him, and for him. And that is kind of summarized by saying in verse 19 of chapter 1 that in him, that is Christ, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Jesus is God. All the fullness of God dwells in Jesus. And another statement like that made in chapter 2, when he says in verse 9 that in him, that is Christ, all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. Jesus is God, therefore he has preeminence, and therefore he should be praised. But that really serves to be the anchor throughout the whole book. And so in chapter 2, for instance, when he is talking about the various false teachings that he wants these Christians to be on guard against, he continually refers back to Christ and how these things are, they are maybe shadows, but not the substance which belongs to Christ, or they are a departure from Christ, or they are a twisting of the nature of Christ. And then we get into chapter 3, and he's talking about how our lives are to be changed. He talks about who we are, and that there is no distinction, chapter 3, verse 11, but Christ is all and in all. And so all the way through, from the beginning, when he focuses on that poetic praise of Jesus, all the way through, Colossians is a book about Christ and his preeminence. Now, remember the phrase is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And that in you, we can see throughout the book of Colossians as Paul talks about Jesus, his preeminence, transforming us from the inside out. And so in that praise, in chapter 1, he talks about how the purpose of Jesus's work was to reconcile us to God in chapter 1, verse 20 and following. And how for Paul's own life and ministry, in the end of chapter 1, he sees himself as sharing in the ministry, proclaiming the mystery of God, sharing in his ministry, and in particular sharing in his sufferings, which is part of Christ being in us, is that we would share in his sufferings that he undertook. We would undertake the same things. But in that section of the various false teachings, you see Paul saying that Christ and the truth about Christ needs to be rooted in us, that we need to take that into our minds and into our hearts so that we will not be deceived or deluded by the teachings of men, the philosophies of men, or these false teachings. And then, of course, in chapter 3, talking about being transformed. Is Christ in us? And he says another just powerful phrase in chapter 3, verse 4, when Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. When Christ, who is your life, that's just an amazing statement, but summarizes what is being said in Colossians. The preeminent Christ dwells in us and changes us from the very inside, from the way we think, to the way that we speak, to the way that we live, and even transforms, as we see in chapters 3 and 4, all of our everyday relationships. Okay, but that's that last verse in chapter 3 is another segue. When Christ, who is your life, is revealed, you will be revealed with him in glory. And so Christ in you, the hope of glory. And Colossians points to our hope all the way through, as we see Paul talking about what it is that we have to look forward to. So whether that's chapter 1, verse 5, the hope laid up for you in heaven, or chapter 1, verse 12, qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints of light. We're looking forward to that inheritance that we will receive. If we will suffer with him now, we look forward to that hope and that inheritance in the future. And so Christ in you, the hope of glory. And that really is I think the boiled down message of this book, as he encourages these Christians that he isn't as close to, but he clearly, as we see again in chapter 4, feels a bond and a fellowship with them because of their connectedness in Christ, who dwells in each of us, and gives each of us that hope of the inheritance in his kingdom. So that's the book of Colossians, and we'll jump into Luke next week.